Clouds crush the moonlight, turning the cockpit into a sealed pocket of black. You stare through the canopy and find nothing to focus on. Sometimes a darker smear slides past, cloud edge or a trick of tension. You breathe, and the glass blooms with a brief haze that is the only thing you can see. For a moment you cannot tell whether you are flying through sky or sinking into a bottomless well made of cloud. A voice comes through the headset, calm and clipped. It does not describe what the enemy looks like. It does not tell you what you should fear. It gives only heading, speed, altitude. 3 lines of numbers on a chalkboard, and you are expected to copy them down. You do it because you have no other choice. In a night fight, the first act is not turning and not firing. It is admitting a brutal fact. Out here, your eyes do not count. In daylight combat, there is intuition. You see the other aircraft, and your body reacts before language catches up. At night, there is no intuition, only procedure. You can be brave, but bravery will not pull an enemy airplane out of blackness by the collar. You can be skilled, but skill only makes you spin faster in the dark and get lost more efficiently. The real core of night fighting is turning I can't see into a task you can work, turning uncertainty into a sequence of steps you can execute. After enough failures, different air forces built the same 3-part chain. On the ground, a controller watches radar returns and treats the airspace like a board. In the aircraft, the intercept set cannot see far, but in the last few miles it can point. In the cockpit, 2 minds share the work. One keeps the airplane steady, the other reads the scope and turns flicker into plain orders. Miss anywhere in that chain, and the clouds take you. That is why the fear of night fighting is oddly shaped. It is not the sudden rush of contact. It is the long waiting. You hear instructions without knowing where the other aircraft is. You know you are flying towards something, but it is not in your view. It exists only on someone else's screen, only inside a stream of commands. You cannot help asking yourself, if I cannot see the enemy, what lets me believe I am actually flying toward it? The ground controller begins to pull you into the game. He gives you a heading. You adjust. A moment later, a correction. You adjust again. You feel as if you are walking a corridor you cannot see, relying on knocks through the wall to know whether you are drifting. The controller cannot see the world you see either. He sees a different map. One line is you, one line is the target. In his hands, the 2 lines are drawn closer, notch by notch. In many post-war memoirs, the ground controller is described as the invisible 3rd crew member. It sounds romantic. The reality underneath is plain. Every turn you make in the air is completing a calculation for a person on the ground. He has to compress the target's heading and speed, your position, cloud effects, and communications delay into a sentence you can understand and still have time to fly. The cleaner you execute, the more his chess game behaves like chess. The more you hesitate, the more he is forced to chase your mistakes with new commands. You can feel the system's tempo. Commands come fast, cut down like scissors. You cannot ask much, you cannot explain much, you only do. Because in the night, the most expensive thing is time. 1 second slow and 2 tracks can shift from closing to missed. Many failures are not a matter of courage. They are a chain of small hesitations that push the geometry back to an angle you cannot recover. And even strong ground radar has its ailments. It sees far, but it does not see fine. It has blind spots, especially low, hugging the earth and ridgelines. And it has to travel through communications. Every command passes through radio waves, noise, and the hiss in your headset you cannot fully strip away. What you hear is always where things were a moment ago, not where they are now. At night, that sliver of delay is enough for 2 tracks to slip past each other. You will hit a moment that chills you. The controller says the target is ahead of you. You fly as told. A few seconds later, he says the target is off your rear quarter. You understand at once. You pass through. A moment ago, you were like 2 cars meeting in fog, door to door, and neither saw the other. You want to snap into a hard turn, climb, do anything that might grab it back. But at night, any violent move can throw you off the chain, and you may never find the correct solution again. So the chain has to hand off. At some distance, the controller says something like, "You are close." Airborne radar takes over. The words sound ordinary, but they shove you toward a nearer cliff. The next few miles come with no wider view, no longer warning. The ground can deliver you to about there. The rest is on you to turn about into right ahead. Sometimes the controller adds a last set of more specific cautions. He may tell you the target is likely to cross from your left front, or remind you not to get greedy and sink too low, because beyond a certain point the ground side can no longer see the relationship between you. You hear a restrained urging, hold heading, hold altitude, do not yank it around. It sounds like restraint. You understand it is protection, keeping a fragile line of geometry from snapping. You steady the airplane. Steadying is not easy. After a long time in the dark, you begin to suspect you are slowly descending, suspect the instruments are lying. The clouds roll around you like tide water without a shore. The harder you lean on instinct to correct, the easier it is to walk away from the solution. So you pin your attention to commands and gauges and force your body's unease down. There is only the scope in the aircraft and the unstable dot on it. The radar operator narrows his focus to a slit. He presses the headset tighter, and on a small kneeboard beside him pencil marks accumulate, short lines and arrows recording each bearing change. The screen glows a thin grey, like fog. In that fog, many things move. Some are cloud, some are ground returns, sea clutter, ridge echoes. They are not a harmless background. They climb like living things and cover the real target. The operator knows he is not working with a clean picture. He is facing an ocean of ambiguity. He starts the search, not with excitement at the first dot, but by steps. Scan, judge, confirm, close. Because the largest trap at night is, see a dot and charge. You think it is the enemy, and it is only a patch of cloud return or a band of reflection off the ground. You rush in and the target vanishes. You turn back and another dot blooms. You chase it and the picture gets worse. In the end, you discover you have been chasing noise, not an airplane. The radar operator speaks in restrained language. He does not say, there it is. He says, possibly in this direction. He does not say, locked. He says, the return looks more like a target. Some crews mistake that tone for lack of confidence. The real veterans know it is respect for the night. At night there are no flags, no paint, no wing glint. A dot on a screen carries no identity, only probability. He calls a direction. You nudge the heading. He calls a change in range. You nudge again. Your language begins to sound like the steps of a math problem, not shouted combat. You start to understand that a night dogfight is a fight of calculation. Miss once, and there is no second attempt. You do not have time to think, where is he? You execute. Make the geometry favorable. Each small heading correction is meant to bring two paths to intersect at one point. Each altitude adjustment is meant to dodge clutter and keep the dot in the beam. The closer you get, the harder it becomes. Airborne radar has limitations baked into it. Its field of view is not wide. Drift a little, and the dot slides off the edge of the scope. It is less sensitive to a target moving across your side. Choose the wrong approach angle, and you trap yourself in the humiliation of so close and still can't see. You have to make the approach as straight as possible, make the return stabilize, make judgment repeatable. In daylight, straight sounds like laziness. At night, it is discipline. The most brutal limit is the minimum range blind zone. Inside a certain distance, the radar suddenly behaves as if it has gone nearsighted. The closer the target, the harder the return can be to separate. You assume closer means clearer. In practice, closer can mean easier to lose. That band of distance is a doorway. Outside the door, you can still hold the dot. Inside, the dot can be swallowed, and you are left with blankness. Many crews fail on that final threshold, not because they cannot find the target, but because they cannot hold themselves at the edge of it. The radar operator's voice slows. He is judging. Is the dot's motion continuous? Does it match an aircraft's speed? Does it split into 2 points? A tremble of clutter? Does it hug the ground? A lie told by terrain returns? He will not use the word certain. He uses sentences that stay cautious, as if speaking in likelihood. You hear those sentences and your chest tightens, because you know there will not be a second explanation. You keep flying. You compress the range bit by bit. The operator says the target is ahead, the distance is closing. You can almost feel something waiting in the dark, yet you still cannot see. You can only watch instruments, listen to commands, feel the engine's vibration. You imagine the other pilot may be equally blind, equally listening to a headset. Two people approaching in blackness with eyes that do not matter. Then the range presses up against the sensitive threshold. The dot on the scope begins to wobble. It looks ready to fall into the blind zone. The operator's breathing pauses for a beat. Your fingers tighten without thinking, closing around the trigger. You hear your own heartbeat and wonder if it can betray you. Still, there is no light, no outline, no wing reflection, only cloud and black, and a report that gets shorter by the second. You do not even know whether your nose is pointed at him or sliding past by a few degrees. When you finally compress the range to near point blank and still cannot see him, do you fire? You hold your finger on the trigger for too long enough to feel like a verdict. The radar operator does not shout, "Fire!" He gives a harder command, "Do not move yet." For an instant you almost protest. You worked so hard to compress the distance, to fish that dot out of noise. Wait one more second, and it may slip into the blind zone or disappear entirely, but his pause is not hesitation. It is warning. He knows the deadliest thing at night is not missing. It is hitting the wrong thing. The ground controller's voice returns tighter than before. He is not urging you to attack. He is urging you to confirm. In night fighting, there is a kind of command that sounds unheroic, even deflating. It does not care whether you have position. It cares whether conditions are met: identification, weapons release authority, altitude deconfliction, return corridors. Each term is a rail set between you and the trigger. Those rails are not meant to bind you. They exist to keep you from turning a teammate into an accident. You know why it has to be this way. At night, friendly and hostile aircraft are almost identical in the information they give you. Neither glows. Both fly under the same cloud. Both may be returning on the same track. On the radar scope, both can be the same jumping speck. The difference is not written on the speck. It is written in the information chain. Whether you have enough evidence, whether the identification signal is stable, whether your altitude layers overlap, whether someone said one wrong phrase in a crowded channel. The radar operator looks up at you as if checking whether you can hold yourself back. You can feel his pressure. You can feel his fear. Many crews later said the most punishing part of night fighting was not the moment of firing, but this blank. The range is close and still you cannot fire, because you are forced to be restrained at the most tense instant. You are forced to admit that you can turn combat into geometry, but you cannot turn human lives into probability. The controller begins feeding you more context. Which friendly aircraft are returning? Which altitude layers are understood as safe? Which corridor leads home? At night, airspace is a dark, three-dimensional city whose roads exist only in invisible rules. A returning group may move like a dark current through your interception box at assigned headings and altitudes. If you stare only at one bright fleck, you may mistake one vessel in that current for the enemy. Worse, radio traffic is often most congested exactly when aircraft return and descend. The channel that carries your intercept may also carry their fuel calls, their landing sequence, their emergency transmissions. Noise becomes not only technical, but social. Too many voices, too many urgent needs. Identification should be the final insurance. At night, insurance becomes unreliable. Readings can wobble with range, attitude, equipment condition. Clutter can mask it. It can go silent when you most need it. You hear the controller confirm again and again, as if tightening a loose screw with words. You understand he is not distrusting you. He is refusing to trust the night. The radar operator proposes a more cautious scheme. Hold range. Do not push yourself inside the blind door. He tells you to arc slightly and watch the target's motion again. It sounds like yielding ground. In fact, it is verification. You ease the nose off. You let the bright fleck trace a short path across the scope. Its speed, its turns, its response to your movement will leak information. If it is hostile, it may try to break away. If it is friendly, it may continue steadily along a return route. You do not gain certainty, you gain a stronger argument. You follow that verification and your anxiety rises, because you know restraint increases the chance of missing. Restraint can let the opportunity walk away, but a deeper fear pins you down. It does not come from the enemy. It comes from the thought, if I am wrong, I will never be able to explain. At night there is no clear picture to prove what you saw. There is only a dot on a scope, commands in a headset, and a few cold lines in an after-action report. You do not want those lines to harden into an irreversible sentence. At last you get a relatively stable identification result, or at least a more defensible exclusion. The ground confirms that, for the moment, no friendly aircraft are passing your altitude layer through that return corridor. The radar operator confirms the behavior looks more like evasive motion. You point the nose back at the fleck and compress again. You enter the last stretch. It is a narrow bridge with black on both sides. Each step has to land between rule and instinct. Just as you think everything is about to resolve into firing, the radar operator pauses again. He is not overturning the judgment. He is reminding you that even if it looks more like a target, you still do not see. Rules of engagement at night often define seeing with brutal strictness because darkness turns confidence into illusion. Many times you can reach adequate certainty only within a very short window. Once the window passes, rules pull your hand back from the trigger. So you make a choice. It may not always be the same choice, but it always shares one trait. It must be defensible under incomplete information. Some crews choose to close further, gambling on a brief moment of visual contact at extreme range. Some hold distance, trading time and verification for safety. Some abandon the attempt and let ground control rebuild the geometry into something manageable. This time you take the more conservative route. You do not push yourself inside the blind door. You let the target slip out of your immediate grasp because that is better than forcing your hand and turning a guess into a shot. You feel a strange hollowness. You came here to shoot something down, and your most important decision is not to. That hollowness is common in night fighting. It makes people mistake themselves for weak. Those who have lived it know it is a threshold. The true threshold is not finding the enemy. It is making the right decision when information is incomplete. You climb back to a slightly higher altitude, not for safety, but to clean up the scope. The radar operator searches again, the controller calculates again. It is like resetting a chessboard, but every reset burns fuel, attention, patience. Night fatigue does not build like a steady climb. It pours in like sand, quietly filling your joints. You begin to understand why mature units emphasize discipline. Discipline is not a pose of calm, it is a tool for resisting exhaustion. Later, even the radio changes. The controller's vectors tighten into set phrases. The radar operator replies with bearings, ranges, corrections. Less description, less argument. Someone has broken the fight into steps that must be repeated in the same order. In many units, progress comes from this hardening of procedure and discipline more than from any one new box of electronics. Rookies often break at that tempo. Their mistake is not fear, but excitement. A dot appears and they treat it as identity. Range decreases and they shove toward the blind threshold, then jerk the airplane when the return slips away. Each big correction thickens clutter. Clutter breeds misreads, and misreads invite bigger corrections until they are chasing noise and calling it initiative. They do not lose to the enemy first. They lose to their own rhythm. Mature crews learn the opposite rhythm. Slow before the door, keep the nose stable, make the smallest clean corrections, and break off sooner when doubt rises. They treat the approach to the blind zone as a warning light, not a victory banner. Conservative does not mean timid, it means repeatable. You cannot guarantee the same luck each sortie, but you can guarantee the same procedure. Training makes that restraint usable. You drill who speaks, who repeats, who confirms, and who is allowed to call stop when identification wobbles or guidance conflicts. From the outside, a seasoned night intercept can look industrial. Vector, handoff, verify, close or break, return. But the machine never removes uncertainty. It presses emotion thinner and fear sharper because the faster the loop runs, the faster one error can become an irreversible shot. You enter another interception. Ground guidance is tighter. Onboard verification is quicker. You compress the distance into a more stable bracket. The radar operator's voice stays cold, but it carries more weight. You can almost picture the speck on the scope being pinned in place. You are pulling a line straight out of chaos. You are closer to fire. And then the controller grows cautious again. He warns you about low altitude. He warns you about terrain. He warns you not to let one dot drag you into a descent. Because the opponent will not sit still while you execute your procedure. The opponent learns. The opponent hides exactly where you hate to look, in clutter, in the low-altitude blind zone, in radio silence. You suddenly understand that industrial efficiency holds only when the opponent cooperates. Once the opponent fights back, the loop is torn and stretched. Your advantage is dragged back to the primitive question. When the chain is disrupted, when the target disappears, when you return to cannot see, what do you have left? You hear the controller's last reminder, sharp as a needle in your ear. Do not assume you have already won. At night, the real contest is only beginning. You thought you had learned the tempo, the coldness of the commands, the jump of that one speck on the screen. But the opponent does not have to destroy your airplane to break your intercept. He only has to place himself where you have the most trouble, force you to lose direction in the noise sea, force hesitation in the seams of the rules, force you to stop at the blind threshold. The controller's voice grows sparser, not because he has gone quiet, but because he has less he can say. The target is lower now, running along terrain like a fish skimming a riverbed. Low altitude is the world radar hates to admit. Ground has blind zones. Ground clutter swallows returns. A small error inflates into a large miss. You can hold altitude in the air, but you know that if the opponent is willing to gamble, he can wedge himself into that unseen crack and remove the fulcrum from your geometry. Worse, sometimes the opponent chooses silence. No replies, no extra emissions, nothing you can seize as a habit. You listen to your own channel, to the constant bass hiss, and realize the most frightening thing is not too much noise. It is too little information. With too little, every dot can be assigned meaning. You start to guess. Guessing is night fighting's most dangerous temptation because it feels like initiative, when it is only fear turning into impulse. You are vectored again into a closing bracket. The radar operator begins searching. The grey on the scope looks thicker. You cannot tell whether the cloud is denser or you are being guided closer to the low-altitude region. A dot appears, weak, like an ember about to die. The operator does not immediately call it target. He calls direction, then a confirmation. He has you correct gently, keeping the return on the screen longer. He watches for continuity, for a ground reflection tail, for the tell that this is not merely terrain noise breathing. You compress range. The air feels heavier, as if the night itself is leaning on you. The operator calls the range limit. His tone is steady, but you hear the tension in it. You are nearing the door. Outside, you can still hold the dot. Inside, it can disappear. Many crews fail here, not because they are not close, but because they are too eager. They push into the blind zone, the dot vanishes, and instinct takes the wheel. Instinct is the enemy in the dark. You do not rush. You hold attitude, hold heading, as if the airplane is nailed to an unseen track. The operator gives you rhythm in shorter reports, direction, range, micro-correction. The controller nearly stops speaking, offering only occasional framework, warning you not to be dragged down by terrain, warning you not to drift into friendly altitude layers. You understand that saying at last, the third crew member exists, but the night limits him too. He can deliver you to the door. Inside, every step belongs to you. And then it happens. For a moment, the dot on the scope brightens. The operator calls a more definite range. He is close to saying the approach has succeeded. You feel as if you can hear the enemy breathing. You are about to press the nose down a fraction more, force the range into a firing window, and the bright fleck jumps, as if swallowed by water. The scope is grey again, the dot is gone. Your body wants to do the most basic thing, snap into a turn, dive, climb, anything that feels better than blankness. The operator's voice pins you like a hand on your shoulder. Do not thrash. Hold. Reacquire. It is short, but it drags you back from a cliff. You both know that thrashing now is suicide. Thrashing enlarges noise, erases the last references, and sinks you deeper into ground clutter. You have entered the most punishing phase of night fighting. Target lost. Not the end of failure, but the start of opposition. This is what the opponent is best at, making you lose the target when you are one step away, letting emotions seize the process, forcing you to tear your own loop open. You have to do the opposite of instinct. In the most tense seconds, make movement smaller, language sparser, judgment slower. The operator sweeps again. He does not rush to find the dot. He rushes to recover your stability. Only stability makes noise readable. You hold altitude and keep the nose from bobbing. You keep every correction minimal, like walking in darkness with a cup filled to the brim, terrified of spilling a drop. The controller gives you a more conservative vector, opening range slightly so you do not remain inside the door without realizing it. Opening range sounds like retreat. It is reacquiring the ability to think. You bring the range back outside the door. The scope becomes a little cleaner. Clutter remains, but its texture changes. Your attitude steadies. The search becomes orderly again. And then the bright fleck returns. It does not leap out in a burst of luck. It appears in a way that fits logic. First a weak return, then persistence across successive sweeps, then movement with a clear trend. The operator does not declare victory. He has you make a micro-correction and watches whether the return shifts as expected. It shifts. Another micro-correction. It shifts again. It is as if you have reached into the dark and found an edge that does not vanish when you touch it. That is the nature of the second crest. Not that you are clever, but that you did not let fear break the process. The opponent can make the target disappear. He cannot make you forget the steps. You treat loss as a condition that will recur, not as an endpoint. With a more conservative approach, strategy, and verification calls, you pull the target back into a manageable zone. You do not depend on a lucky glimpse. You do not depend on a heroic intuition. You depend on the resilience of the loop. The controller cuts in with a brief confirmation, like stamping your paper. Friendly altitude separation still holds. The return corridor does not intersect. Your identification conditions are closer to being met. The operator breaks the last segment into even finer pieces. He reminds you not to push too deep into the blind zone. He reminds you to stabilize at the threshold. He reminds you that firing is not the climax of motion, but the last condition in a process. You compress range again. The dot persists. You can feel it ahead. You still cannot see. And you begin to grow accustomed to that. You start trusting the short reports in your headset more than your eyes. You start thinking of yourself as an actuator inside a chain, not an individual fighting by feel. It sounds cold. It is the essence of night combat. You make the invisible manageable, translate noise into answer. Whether you fire, whether there is a kill, is not the only ledger that matters in the dark. Sometimes success is a corridor kept clear, a formation brought home, a wrong target not turned into silence. On the way back, the sky is still black and the radio still crowded. But the traffic sounds ordinary again. Fuel states, landing order, requests for lights. Only then does exhaustion rise, not from violent maneuvers, but from hours of turning uncertainty into steps and refusing to let instinct write answers. When you land, you feel almost nothing. In daylight, you would describe what you saw. Tonight, you saw nothing. What remains are short commands, small corrections, a loss, a reacquisition, the dot flickering and then holding. You remember the moment your hand stayed off the trigger and the moment the loop held together. You remember not a fireball, but a sentence that meant the geometry was still alive. Target ahead, range closing. That is air combat in the dark when you cannot see. It is not daylight combat carried into blackness. It is war carried into an information chain. You no longer decide life and death with your eyes, but with process, coordination, rules, and verification. You no longer chase airplanes with your turn. You chase a return on a scope with calculation. Whoever can read noise into an answer can make the invisible manageable in the night, turn fear into steps, and turn steps into survival. And when both sides come to rely on that chain, the contest is never only about equipment. It is about who can still hold the loop in the blackest moments, hold discipline, hold that cold command, until one tiny bright fleck stands firm again in the sea of noise.